It is 4 in the morning on October the 24th, 1917, and somewhere in the mountains of northern Italy, thousands of men are lying in mud, in freezing rain, waiting for an order that will change the course of the First World War. Within 24 hours, one of the largest armies in Europe will stop existing as a fighting force. Not because it was outnumbered, not because it was outgunned, but because of a weapon so terrifying that grown men would rip off their own gas masks in blind panic and breathe in their own deaths. This is the story of the battle that should never have been won, the battle that turned a young lieutenant into a legend before he ever set foot in a tank, and the battle whose name became a word for total, humiliating collapse in the Italian language itself. If you think you know how World War I was fought, slow, grinding, static trench warfare, with nothing ever really happening, stay until the end, because what you're about to hear will completely change that picture. And trust me, the last 5 minutes of this story are the part nobody expects. By the autumn of 1917, the war had already dragged on for 3 brutal years, and Germany and Austria-Hungary knew, deep down, that time was against them. America had just entered the war on the side of the Allies, and it was only a matter of time before fresh, well-fed, well-equipped American divisions started pouring onto the Western Front. Back home, German and Austro-Hungarian civilians were starving. Bread lines stretched for blocks, coal was scarce, soldiers went weeks without proper rations, sometimes without even salt for their food, and worse, the alliance between Berlin and Vienna was cracking. The Habsburg Emperor, young Karl, had secretly been feeling out the idea of a separate peace behind Germany's back. If Austria-Hungary dropped out of the war, the entire eastern flank of the German war machine would collapse. Something had to give, and fast. But there was one flicker of hope. Russia had been consumed by revolution, and the new Bolshevik government wanted out of the war entirely. That meant the Eastern Front, which had drained Austro-Hungarian strength for 3 years, was finally quieting down. The only enemy still actively bleeding Austria-Hungary dry was Italy, which had launched 11 brutal offensives along the Isonzo River since 1915, gaining almost nothing but grinding down the Austro-Hungarian army to a shadow of what it once was. If the Central Powers could knock Italy out of the fight, or at least cripple it badly enough, Austria-Hungary could survive long enough to help Germany launch one final desperate offensive on the Western Front in the spring of 1918. Everything, the entire war, was starting to hinge on what happened next in the mountains along the Italian border. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand just how strange this alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary actually was, because it explains almost everything that happens later in this story. These were 2 different empires, speaking different languages, run by different royal families, forced together by circumstance rather than genuine trust, and nowhere was that tension more obvious than on the Italian front. Here is where it gets interesting, because the Austro-Hungarians actually wanted to do this alone. Their emperor wrote directly to the German Kaiser, practically begging to be allowed to fight this one without German help, saying, and I am paraphrasing his own words here, that his soldiers had inherited a hatred for Italy since childhood, that this was their war, their enemy, their fight, but Berlin did not trust Vienna's army to pull it off alone, and honestly, they were right not to. German high command believed the Austro-Hungarian military was too exhausted, too demoralized to launch a successful offensive on its own. So Germany created a new combined force, the 14th Army, German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers fighting side by side under a German general named Otto von Below. Buried inside this army was a mountain infantry unit, and inside that unit was a 25-year-old lieutenant who had already been decorated for bravery on 2 other fronts. His name was Erwin Rommel, yes, that Rommel, 23 years before he became the legendary Desert Fox of North Africa, before Hitler ever knew his name, before he commanded tanks against the British in the sands of Libya. Erwin Rommel was a young infantry officer about to fight the battle that would define his entire philosophy of war, and what he learned in these mountains would echo quite literally decades later on the beaches of Normandy. The plan itself had a name, Operation Waffentreue, meaning loyalty in arms, or sometimes called Operation Isonzo. The idea was simple to say and brutally hard to execute. German and Austro-Hungarian stormtroopers would infiltrate a narrow 40-kilometer stretch of the Italian line near a small village called Caporetto, seize the high ground above it, and then race down through the valleys before the Italians even knew what was happening. One Austrian officer described it perfectly. Picture a fist punching straight through a wall and then opening up, fingers spreading out in every direction once it's through. This was the same infiltration tactic the Germans had just used with stunning success weeks earlier on the Eastern Front. Nobody was entirely sure it would work here, in the mountains, against a different enemy, and honestly, some officers on both sides privately doubted it could be pulled off at all in terrain this brutal. Mountain warfare was not supposed to allow for fast, fluid infiltration. Trenches in the Alps were carved into rock, defended by machine guns, positioned on cliffs that seemed impossible to approach from any angle except straight ahead, directly into the guns, and yet that was exactly the assumption the attackers were counting on. They were about to find out just how wrong that assumption really was. On paper, the numbers looked almost even. Around 350,000 Central Powers troops with 2,500 guns, against roughly 250,000 Italians defending with 1,300 guns of their own. Not exactly a guaranteed slaughter, but numbers on paper rarely tell the whole story, and this is where things start to get genuinely fascinating, because everything that was about to go wrong for Italy had almost nothing to do with the size of either army. The terrain alone should have made this attack nearly impossible. Supply routes wound through narrow mountain roads. There simply were not enough trains or railway cars to move men and equipment fast enough. Central Powers troops were already hungry, already exhausted, already short on cigarettes and salt, of all things. And yet the Italian side was, somehow, in even worse shape psychologically. Morale had been bleeding out for 2 straight years of pointless offensives that gained nothing but graveyards. The overall Italian commander, General Luigi Cadorna, ran his army with a discipline so excessive and so punishing that it crushed the will of his own men rather than strengthening it. Executions for cowardice were common. Soldiers were terrified of their own officers as much as the enemy. And Cadorna himself was distracted, tangled up in political power games back in Rome, instead of focused on his own front lines. Italian positions along the river had their backs against the water, with no real defense in depth, an incredibly dangerous setup if the line ever broke. The British cabinet, watching from a distance, was blunt about it. Their own assessment was that the Austrians were suffering more from hunger and thirst than from actual Italian gunfire. Something was deeply wrong in the Italian ranks, and everyone outside of Italy seemed to sense it before the battle had even begun. And then, on the very eve of the attack, something happened that should have saved Italy completely. 2 Austro-Hungarian officers, 1 Romanian and 1 Czech, both from ethnic minorities inside the multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire who had no real loyalty to Vienna, deserted across the lines and warned the Italians that a massive attack was coming. Imagine that. The defenders knew they had the warning. They had the exact intelligence they needed to prepare. A furious German general ranted that an army containing such, in his words, oppositional and inferior elements could no longer be trusted to keep a secret. And yet, incredibly, the Italian high command essentially ignored the warning. Think about that for a second. The single greatest gift a defending army could ask for, a direct warning of an incoming attack, and it was tossed aside. This one decision, or rather, this one failure to act, would cost Italy more than almost anything else that happened in the days that followed. Historians have argued for over a century about why the warning was dismissed so easily. Some point to simple bureaucratic arrogance, the assumption that no attack in these mountains, in this weather, at this time of year, could possibly be as serious as 2 defectors claimed. Others suggest Italian command was simply too deep in its own political infighting back in Rome to react quickly to frontline intelligence. Whatever the reason, the window to prepare, to reposition reserves, to brace for the worst, was there wide open, and it was allowed to close. If you think that is the turning point of this story, wait, because the actual disaster had not even started yet, and what comes next is even more shocking. At dawn on October the 24th, German and Austro-Hungarian artillery unleashed a short, savage 4-hour bombardment, and mixed into that barrage was something the Italians were not remotely prepared for. Poison gas, a deadly cocktail nicknamed for the different colored markings on the shell casings. The gas attack was almost sadistically effective. Irritant gases forced Italian soldiers to rip off their own masks to breathe, and the moment they did, deadlier chemical agents poured into their lungs. Entire artillery batteries were wiped out before they could fire a single shot back. Under cover of darkness and driving rain, Central Powers infantry surged forward and found gap after gap in the Italian defenses. Erwin Rommel himself would later note just how devastatingly effective the counter-battery fire had been that night. 1,000 gun muzzles flashing in the darkness like the worst thunderstorm anyone had ever witnessed. Italian searchlights swept uselessly through the rain, barely able to see, let alone respond. Whole Italian units suddenly discovered they were surrounded, outflanked, cut off from retreat, with enemy soldiers appearing behind them from directions nobody thought were even possible to attack from. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers simply surrendered. One Italian lieutenant, marching for 8 straight hours through the night to a prisoner of war camp, could barely stay on his feet from exhaustion and shame, later describing the feeling as nothing short of the annihilation of his own inner life. This is where Rommel's story becomes almost unbelievable. And if you have ever wondered how a future field marshal earned his reputation, this is it. His small unit bypassed enemy positions entirely on the lower mountain slopes, climbed silently uphill through the fog and rain, and crept up directly above an Italian position without a single defender noticing. From high above, looking straight down into the trench, Rommel's men realized the Italians below had absolutely no cover against fire coming from that angle. They simply had not considered that anyone could attack from there. Rommel's soldiers readied their weapons, shouted down a demand to surrender, and the terrified Italian garrison, staring up in disbelief, immediately gave the signal to give up. This single tactic, using terrain, surprise, and pure audacity instead of brute force, would repeat itself again and again across the battlefield that day, and Italian resistance began crumbling everywhere all at once. And Rommel was far from the only officer pulling off tactics like this. All across the 40-kilometer front, small squads of German and Austro-Hungarian stormtroopers were doing the exact same thing, slipping around fixed positions instead of charging into them, climbing where nobody expected soldiers to climb, appearing behind enemy lines like ghosts. It was less a single battle and more hundreds of small, coordinated ambushes happening simultaneously across an entire mountain range, and the cumulative effect on Italian morale was catastrophic. Word spread through the ranks faster than any official report could travel, and with it spread fear, the belief that the enemy could appear literally anywhere, at any time, from any direction. That fear did more damage than any single artillery barrage could have. By the afternoon of just the first day, Central Powers troops had captured the village of Caporetto itself, and some local Austro-Hungarian residents actually lined the streets cheering the advancing soldiers, shouting "Long live Austria" in their own language. Command finally ordered a full retreat to the Tagliamento River, but it was already far too late. The Italian Second Army was not retreating in any organized sense anymore. It was simply disintegrating. Now here is a moment that puts everything into perspective. Cadorna, the Italian commander, refused to blame his own strategic failures, his own harsh discipline, his own ignored intelligence warnings. Instead, he publicly blamed his own soldiers for cowardice, accusing entire units of retreating without a fight or, in his own words, ignominiously surrendering to the enemy. Meanwhile, the actual soldiers on the ground were marching for days without sleep, without food, simply staggering forward because there was nowhere else to go. And if you think Italy's disaster had already peaked, brace yourself, because it was about to get so much worse. On October the 29th, panicked Italian engineers blew up a critical bridge over the Tagliamento River, trapping two entire divisions of their own men on the wrong side of the water and condemning most of them straight into enemy captivity. Draconian new orders even allowed officers to execute their own stragglers on sight. These exact scenes of chaos and desperation were so haunting that a young Red Cross ambulance driver named Ernest Hemingway would later weave them directly into his novel A Farewell to Arms. That book you might have read in school, or seen referenced in 100 other places, was inspired by the literal horror unfolding on these riverbanks. Rommel, meanwhile, was not slowing down at all. At one point, he flatly disobeyed a direct order to fall back tactically, choosing instead to press the attack on another Italian position, and his tiny unit captured it anyway. Not long after, his small band of soldiers managed to convince two entire Italian regiments to surrender, an almost absurd ratio of captors to captives. Austrian officers who witnessed the endless columns of prisoners marching backward described scene after scene of tragic, heart-wrenching suffering, wounded men stumbling past in the freezing night, and the soldiers escorting them so hungry themselves that they had nothing left to offer their own prisoners. By early November, Central Powers forces had advanced roughly 150 kilometers in just 17 days, an almost impossible pace for World War I. Italy had lost around 40,000 men killed or wounded, a staggering 290,000 men taken prisoner, and somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 more who simply deserted or scattered into the countryside. Germany and Austria-Hungary, by contrast, lost only 50 to 70,000 killed and wounded combined. They also seized nearly 1 million winter coats, 10 million ration packs, and 3,000 artillery guns, an almost unbelievable haul of captured supplies. Back home, Austro-Hungarian newspapers were calling it the miracle of Caporetto, and the government launched a new war bonds campaign with the Catholic Church itself throwing enthusiastic public support behind it. It genuinely felt, for one brief shining moment, like heaven itself had chosen a side. Kaiser Wilhelm himself, along with Bulgaria's own monarch, personally toured the newly captured territory, basking in the scale of the triumph. But behind the parades and the propaganda, the reality on the ground was far uglier. Central Power soldiers, themselves exhausted and starving after weeks of forced marching, began looting captured Italian towns and villages, out of sheer desperation, taking food, clothing, anything they could find. One Austrian officer who witnessed this firsthand described his own comrades as emaciated men in torn, filth-soaked uniforms, without even proper undergarments, staring blankly ahead with bloodshot eyes as they stumbled forward day after day without rest, without sleep, without food, simply forward, 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 even in victory. This was not the picture of a triumphant, well-supplied army. It was the picture of a force running on pure momentum and fumes, and that distinction would matter enormously in the weeks to come. But history loves irony, and this is where the story takes its final, darkest turn. Because Austria-Hungary's greatest victory of the entire war was also, quietly, its most dangerous one. Moving that many men and guns had consumed every available train and railway line in the empire, which meant that food, already desperately scarce, could no longer reach the starving cities back home. The celebrations of victory lasted only days before they curdled into even worse hunger and even deeper resentment among an already exhausted population. Government bureaucrats had actually warned about exactly this outcome before the offensive even began, but military command gambled anyway. Society back home was now closer to collapse than it had ever been, even while its army was celebrating the single greatest battlefield triumph of the entire war. Meanwhile, the shock of the disaster forced Britain and France to rush over 200,000 troops to prop up their collapsing ally. And the near catastrophe finally pushed the Allies to create a unified Supreme War Council, something that arguably should have existed from the very start of the war. Italy replaced its disgraced commander, brought in a new general who finally eased the brutal discipline that had crushed morale in the first place, and remarkably, exhausted Italian soldiers, including terrified young draftees barely out of their teenage years, somehow found the will to dig in and hold the line along the Piave River in mid-November, finally stopping the advance for good. So what actually happened to the young lieutenant who helped make all of this possible? Erwin Rommel received Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite, for his actions during this campaign, and was promoted to captain almost immediately afterward. But the real legacy came later, when Rommel drew directly on everything he had learned in these mountains to write his hugely influential book, Infantry Attacks, a manual built entirely around speed, calculated risk, and deception on the battlefield. 2 decades later, he would apply those exact same lessons in the deserts of North Africa, earning the nickname the Desert Fox from his own enemies. And in 1944, he took command of an entire army group in northern France, tasked with defending against the coming Allied invasion of Normandy, arguing unsuccessfully as it turned out that German tanks needed to be positioned right at the beaches rather than held back inland. He was severely wounded shortly after the invasion began, implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler, and ultimately took his own life rather than face a public trial. One young lieutenant, learning to fight in the fog and rain above Caporetto, ended up shaping the entire doctrine of mobile warfare for a generation of soldiers who would fight the next great war a full 20 years later. And that, right there, is the real story of Caporetto. Not just a battle, but a warning about what happens when a single overlooked warning, a single ignored piece of intelligence, is allowed to slip through the cracks. A victory so complete it terrified the very empire that won it, because winning too much too fast can break you just as easily as losing. If this story pulled you in, if you found yourself imagining Rommel crouched in that mountain fog looking down into an unsuspecting trench, then you already understand why this single battle, more than almost any other moment in World War I, deserves to be remembered as one of history's most dramatic, most consequential, and most quietly terrifying turning points.